or we have come to the end of the David story, or even a broader story than that, because we're coming to the end of the Samuel stories. And give me just highlights as we kind of approach the end. What are some of the highlights that we have seen in 1st and 2nd Samuel? What would be things that you would consider worth remembering from 1st and 2nd Samuel?
David becoming king.
Okay, David becomes king. And what's the situation around David becoming king? Do you remember?
He had
Okay, Saul is the youngest of the sons, Jesse's sons, and anointed by Samuel, right? And all the stories that we're looking at, one of the remarkable things, and we've mentioned it before, with stories, the stories have meaning. Just information doesn't necessarily, by its nature, have meaning. It's just a series of events. But when we take the series of events and shape it, then all of a sudden they have meaning. Stories have lessons, and that's why stories tend to endure, as opposed to some other things that aren't quite as memorable in the future. And this is what's happening here. He's taking stories that's existed, putting them in a narrative, but also shaping the stories themselves so that they have a meaning. And so if we look at the anointing of David, what might we glean from that? What might we take from that
What
story?
I got from that was David. So he was a king anointed by God himself. He was chosen by God.
Okay.
So I get all of God's, and God chose the least likely,
Okay.
the youngest. So God
Right.
can do anything with anybody.
Okay.
And he was a shepherd, so God picked him to be a shepherd over his people.
Okay.
And the shepherd is caring and all of that. And then we go on further on with David's story, and we see his weaknesses, we see how God works in them. David's a great story.
Okay.
We
And
can
that's-
relate a lot with humanity and how God works in our lives through how
the
he
David
worked
story.
in David's
It's
life.
sort of
Okay.
like the rise and downfall of David. This whole
The
thing.
rise and now what would be some of the things that you would see as part of the rise? What are
What you
characters?
just said.
Okay. What else would you say is contributing to the rise of David? Certainly, this is God's story, so God is in control of it all. What do we see with David?
Well, he cared for his people.
Okay, David had a concern for his people. Okay, what else do we see
And talked to
with
God
David?
about
Okay,
decisions.
David tended to talk to God about his needs and the needs and seeking direction. What else do we see as David is ascending?
He was strong for his people, a good leader.
Okay, he was a good leader, strong, and in a lot of different ways, because he was certainly militarily strong, because that seems emphasized early on in the story, that he was a great military leader. And understand, and we're going to even see it in an allusion in one of the stories we're looking at the end. We're talking about a time when you've got warrior kings. So the kings are warriors.
Yes.
They aren't generals that are directing. They are
Fighting.
fighting, because that's what they were. They were warriors. And so, you have more engaged in a very physical way. And that's what we see with David. What else do we see? So David is compassionate towards his people. He shows a lot of strength in a lot of areas. He consults God, and God is certainly involved in this story. Now, you said it was a rise and a fall.
Yes.
What would you say as you look at this story of David? And of course, there are other characters involved. We've got Samuel that's important at the beginning, and we certainly have Saul that's important as David is ascending. What would you consider David's peak? When does David hit in this story? his highest point?
Well, he defeated the Philistines and he set up a city of his own, brought the ark back.
Okay,
So politically, he was at a peak militarily, and then economically, they were really done. Everybody had food and resources that they needed.
okay. So David reached out. It's really interesting, Denny, what you said, because what we're going to see when we get into the books of the Kings, we haven't seen it so much yet, but we're going to see as we enter Kings, the quality of the king is going to really reflect the people. In other words, when the king is righteous, the people are righteous. When the king is wicked, the people are wicked. The king almost personifies the people over which he rules. Now, we haven't seen that so much with Saul and David, but we are going to see it as we get into the books of the Kings. So when Israel or Judah is ruled by an evil king, the people are going to be evil. And therefore God is going to punish the people. Going to punish everybody. And that's what we're going to start seeing in the books of the Kings. Okay, but and you kind of alluded to it. Things politically and kind of focused on David, but in a broader sense, politically things are secure. Economically things are going pretty well. It's not just David, but it kind of trickles down to the people. They're involved in this too. So religiously, spiritually, economically, militarily, politically, as he sits in Jerusalem, David is strong. Okay. And so is his country. Now, that's the pinnacle. You said rise and fall.
Yeah, he started to come down.
What's the fall? What is the? Tell me about the decline.
He met a woman that was married, and
Isn't it always the case?
Yeah.
He meets a woman, and boom,
Yeah.
everything falls apart.
And then he sends her husband out to get killed.
You know what? That's when they start turning on the air conditioning.
That must be
Yeah,
it.
when they meet a woman, absolutely. So he meets a woman, everything starts going to pot. In particular, what woman does he meet? Bathsheba. And of course, the story of Bathsheba is not a very pleasant story.
It's almost like she drained all his energy, or all his, when he met her, it's like nothing else mattered as much as she did. You know what I mean? His kingdom or...
The funny part is though, she really didn't do anything. She took a bath.
Yeah.
He did all the
Yeah.
mischief.
Yeah.
We're going to put the
Right.
blame on the other side of the coin.
For a
Right.
change. Yeah, for a change, huh?
What can you say?
Yeah, sometimes.
That's it. So we end up with a decline, and really when we look at it, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because she is really, she's almost incidental to the story.
But yet she gets so much blame.
Now, but in the story, she doesn't. She's not held accountable in the story. But who is? Who is held accountable? David is. And it's not just one choice, it's a whole series of choices that he makes. And fortunately, we have arrived in our society when people who are caught in situations like that, they openly admit it. And they don't try to cover it up.
Oh, no.
They admit it and are willing to take the consequences of their actions. So we are now at a place where we're not much better than we used to
David
be.
became almost a coward, as opposed to the way he was, when he was a military, really strong dude. And,
Yeah.
And just sort of fell off and stayed behind. And
Yeah, because that was the initial. When kings go to war. It's interesting you say that, because I really hadn't thought about it, because while he's making this plan of how to get rid of Uriah, he's a panicked guy, but this is an intricate plan. He's thinking about it, and he's thinking, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a good idea.
What do you think made him panic?
Well, what do you think? And I think this is really characteristic of people. That's what people tend to do. continue to do, will always do.
We cover up.
What's the initial concern?
It's probably how what people think of him.
Okay,
Since he's the king,
people might not like him so
He doesn't do
much.
anything about it.
And
He still stays a coward.
yeah.
So
and he's-
what causes him, back to my question.
yeah.
What's that?
Well, if you look at the shape of the story, what has David, by taking this course of action, what has David actually done? I mean, he's covering up, and we can identify that because in our society, people are constantly covering up. That's just what they do. Maybe that's a real negative because it's happened so often we've kind of accepted it. Oh yeah, well, he does, he's doing what everybody does, so we don't care. Maybe that's not good, but that's what we've kind of done. In the context of this story, though, it's not just that he's covering something up. What is he doing that really reflects not only a genuine problem, but a significant change in David that's important in the context of this narrative that's being shaped?
He's sort of depending on other people to help make his
Yeah,
decisions.
he didn't go to God.
Okay, depending on others, and God really isn't engaged in this.
There you go.
God really isn't engaged in this, and so now we've got this problem within this context. God isn't playing a role in David's decision making, and one of the things you said early on is that David would consult God. That was something important in his character, and we don't see God involved here right now. In fact, we don't see God with David playing a huge role again.
I love it. So this is what I feel Christians today, the world today, we all have a tendency to depend on money, we depend on other people, we depend on this. We need to depend on God. He's the one that leads and guides us through the Spirit. So I love that point of this whole thing. Everything else is going on, but he's not putting number one in number one place.
Yeah, not like he
Because
used
the
to.
minute you do that, everything changes again.
But you know what?
When you start following that.
The funny
Go
part,
ahead.
when, David would talk to God and do whatever God said, but in between those times, he would go rob and steal. And,
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff going on in David's character. But he's in a decline, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, what ends up happening to David? So David does this. What ends up happening?
He flees.
Okay, he ends up running, hiding. Why?
I don't know why.
Because
He's
his
son.
son.
Okay, yeah, he has big problems in his family, right? His family kind of falls apart.
Do you think part of that was because of what David did, and from the moment he met Bathsheba, and then they became a unit,
I think that was the consequence of it.
Yeah,
What
with
did
his sons.
what did Nathan say when he confronted David?
Trouble in your family.
What's that?
He told him there'd be trouble.
There'd be trouble in the
Yeah.
family. There's going to be trouble in your house, and that's exactly what happened. So again, the context is always this is not primarily the story of David. This is the story it's still the story of God.
Absolutely.
And that David's going to face consequences for his actions, and the consequences are severe, and he never recovers. There's no recovery from the consequences. In fact, if anything, what ends up happening to David as we go through this?
He loses all his strength,
He loses his strengths, he loses
doesn't
his...
go to God all the time and ask.
Right, he's reacting, and he faces some genuine problems. I mean, he has a son that rebels against him, and then he faces another revolution, the Sheba revolt that we talked about last week. So we've got David ending up facing the consequences for his actions. Now again, on a couple of levels, this is really interesting, I think, because this redactor is writing this about David. And how will the Jews view David in the future? How will the Jews to whom he's sending this, how do they view David?
I don't think they would view him the same way.
Well, okay, because the people are viewing David as a hero. This is the founding of our country. The Davidic king. And so it would be really tempting to shape this story. And so let me tell you how great this guy is. How wonderful he is. But that's not what the redactor does. He gives this other side, which really points the story away from David being this great hero to David being a person who is judged and accountable to God. And that becomes kind of what we see in the story. And even a king pays consequences for his action. Even kings pay consequences. If not by the people, because he kind of skirts these revolts, pays consequences ultimately in the sight of God. That's something you can't skirt. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we see that with David. Now, if the story ended with where we ended last week, with the Sheba revolt, and that's kind of an odd thing, because it again points to something we're going to see later in the book of the Kings, the breakup of Judah and the other tribes, the other 10 tribes. We would see David, and then David dies. Then David has reached the end. But then we've got these last few chapters, which are interesting. The last 3 chapters in the book of 2 Samuel. Because David's still alive, right? Mm-hmm. So and in fact, he's not going to die in the book of 2 Samuel. He's not going to die until we get to the first chapter of the book of the Kings. So what after this thing with Sheba, that is put down, but again, it came with a cost. We've got a divided kingdom that used to be united under David. We enter chapter 21, and what's happening?
There's a famine.
We got a famine in the land, right? And how long has this famine been going on?
3 years.
3 years. Now, according to again in this story, what does David do?
He talked to God.
Wait a minute. Whoa. He did what?
Right.
He did what? Talk to God.
Sought the face of the Lord.
What we're going to see in these last few chapters is they don't seem to be chronological. Mm-hmm. They in fact, one is he ain't even king. He's in dealing with the Philistines. So it's almost like, and it this is what I think is happening. I think we've got some stories that after this narrative of David, that's been very clean, this decline has been very clean, all of a sudden he's got stories left over that he believes are really important, but they don't fit into his narrative. But he wants the people to know him, to hear him, but they don't fit anywhere else. And so he kind of puts them at the end, which is okay. I mean, he can do whatever he wants. He's the writer. I think, you could view it as chronological if you want. That's fine. But there's nothing in here that says, well, this has got to be chronological. I mean, he says, show me. Where does it say this is chronological?
Yeah, and I don't even think that's all that important.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And so I don't think this is flows. I don't think this happens after the Sheba, because David is doing something he didn't do anymore. At the end, he's inquiring, and that's something he did a lot earlier, but hasn't done recently.
I love what. And I can't remember.
Janet.
I'm sorry. I want to say Judy. I knew it started with a J. Forgive me.
That's all right.
So what she said is like he talked to God, but I love the way the writer puts in. God says to him, "I gave you 3 choices," and the part I love is that David said, you're a God of mercy. He knows who his God is. I'm going to let you pick what's going to happen to me. God chooses the lesser of three evils, and then after a certain amount, which was only 3 days, he says, it is enough.
Hold on that, because we're going to get there. That's the last chapter. That's 24. So we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Okay, but here we got a famine, right? We got a famine in the land, and David does something he hasn't done in a while, right? He goes to God, and what does the Lord tell him?
Because it was because of
Okay,
Saul.
now we got something with Saul, going back to Saul. And what is the problem with Saul? I mean, what has happened that has caused this famine? That the Lord tells David is the cause of this famine?
Because Saul put the Gibeonites.
Okay, because Saul put the Gibeonites to death. He slaughtered Gibeonites. Well, where does it say he slaughtered Gibeonites? Don't think too hard, it doesn't. There's no mention of Saul slaughtering Gibeonites.
That me too, I was trying to look back.
In the narrative, there's no mention.
Yeah.
But there is a mention of Gibeonites. In fact, we talked about it in here. Gibeonites. Does anybody have any idea? And if you do, you will earn a jewel in your crown. Now it'll be garnet. It's not going to be a great one. I mean, it's not going to be like a diamond. But you may get a garnet out of it. Do you remember where we talked about the Gibeonites?
I don't even know where we are at the moment.
Okay, we're in chapter 21. Chapter 21. Okay,
Okay.
chapter 21. Okay, good. Gibeonites. Way back in the book of Joshua. Remember, Joshua was given a command from God. What was Joshua's command? That made us uncomfortable when we read it and should make us uncomfortable. What did God command Joshua when he entered the land? Kill everything.
Oh, yeah.
Kill everything. Kill every man, kill every woman, kill every child, kill every animal, kill everything. And he's doing it, right? That's what he's doing.
Yep.
In the 9th chapter of Joshua, people that live in the city of Gibeon come up with an idea. Because Joshua is killing everything in sight. And they're sweating it out. And they decide to dress in raggedy clothes and go to Joshua and say, look at us. We got nothing. We got absolutely nothing. You could kill us if you want, but we're willing to serve you. We'll be your slaves. And we're not a threat because we got nothing. We're just these real poor people. We just want to survive. And you see it in chapter 9, 10, and 11 of Joshua. And Joshua says, without consulting the Lord, Joshua says, sounds like a deal to me. If you follow through on what you said, you're going to be our servants. From now on, we won't kill you. And they leave and no, thank you, and go back to the city and change their clothes. And put on the clothes they were wearing because they didn't have nothing. But they still were servants. They still did follow through on what they promised, but they fooled him. They deceived him, and that was the point. But Joshua said, we have a covenant with you. Therefore, we are not going to kill you. You will serve us. And that's what they've done. Evidently, what did Saul do? And this is the only time we hear it. Saul must have done what? And even the writer knows that we haven't seen this before. Because in verse 2, what does the writer do for us? It's a pretty good indication that he knows he hasn't talked about it. gives us a little stuff in parentheses, doesn't he? You know, now let me tell you who the Gibeonites are. You know, they aren't Jews, they're Amorites, and Israel promised to spare them, which is rooted, grounded in Joshua. So the writer knows that his reader doesn't know. That's why he gave us this information. Okay, so anyway, so Saul evidently has done this. What does David do as a king? And, you know, again, he's acquired of the Lord. What does David do as king?
He asked them what that he can do for them.
Okay, calls the Gibeonites in. What can I do for you? And then, it's interesting. Oh, why did Saul do it? The writer even tells us why Saul wiped them out. Tried to kill so many of them. Why he was trying to wipe them out. Why was Saul trying to kill the Gibeonites? And this is typical Saul. This is in keeping with how the writer has presented Saul.
Because they were survivors?
Well, what does he say? What does the redactor say in verse 2? In that little parentheses.
Zeal for Israel and Judah.
Because he is so fired up. Fired up for the Lord. Right? And fired up for the Lord. And so what is he going to do? He's going to kill those foreigners. Foreigners in the land. We're going to kill them. Right? How is that Saul? How does that reflect Saul's character? Why do we read that and say, oh yeah, that'd be something Saul would do?
Was he done it before?
Well, because Saul, one of his great, almost his tragic flaw in looking at Saul is what? What's this huge flaw within Saul? Wasn't his sincerity.
Acting before thinking.
Acting before thinking. He's impetuous. He acts before he thinks. And he has to act immediately. You know, he doesn't pause and kind of let things work out. He
Jumps in.
performs a sacrifice before priests come, and makes a promise about eating before battle. And, you know, he just does stupid things. He acts without thinking. And this is Saul getting all fired up. It wasn't that Saul wasn't religious. He was. But he didn't do what God wanted him to do, which is also a good lesson, you know, for us. That just being spiritual doesn't mean you're going to necessarily do what God wants you to do, or that you'll avoid consequences. So he went to get these foreigners out of the land. He started killing them, and he just started to kill people that God had, or that Joshua said Jews would not be killed. And he did it anyway. And so David calls them in, and what do you want? What do you want, Gibeonites? And the Gibeonites say,
They have no right to ask for anything, basically. Right?
well, they say, because David seems to be saying, you know, what deal can we cut? Because I know what Saul did was wrong. You know, what can I do for you?
Yeah.
And the Gibeonites say,
Give us 7 male descendants.
yes, put away your checkbook. You know, put away your checkbook. We're not looking for gold and silver. What we would like is 7 descendants, sons of, or descendants of Saul. And what are we going to do with them? We're going to impale them.
So why does it say in chapter 4 where they say they have no right to demand silver or gold, nor do we have the right to put anyone in Israel to death? And then they say they want...
Right? What are they saying when they say we don't want stuff, we don't want gold and stuff, and we don't have the right to put anybody to death, because that was a deal that they made sort of with Joshua. So they don't have a right to do it, but who does? King David has a right to send. If King David gives them the right, they have the right. You know, if King David says, you know, this is what we're going to do, you give us a 7 and we're going to impale them, then who's taking responsibility?
They were more or less looking for permission.
Yeah. Now, David has given them the right. David is the one that's acting. In other words, they can't go and kidnap the seven, or they can't go
Okay.
and kill them themselves.
Okay.
That's why it's got to go through David.
Through David.
Yeah,
Okay.
which means the Gibeonites, they aren't doing what Joab did. When he just went on his own and sought
Taking-
revenge,
taking it on.
on Abner. They're going through channels, right? They're going through channels, and what does David do?
He gives it to
Yeah,
him.
he gets
Okay,
it.
he gives it to them, right? And what do?
They kill him.
They kill him. They impale him. Okay? And one of the mothers, Ziba, how does she respond to her son being impaled?
She took sackcloth and spread it out over for herself on a rock.
Okay, which means what? When she's doing this
She's
with
mourning.
sackcloth, she's mourning, right? She's mourning, and what does David? So as his mother is mourning the death of her son, what does David do?
He took the bones of Saul and Jonathan.
Okay, he takes the bones of
All these
Saul
other
and
bones
Jonathan,
and buries them in the tomb.
and as well as the bones of Saul and Jonathan. Who else does he collect?
All these other.
Yeah, these seven guys that have been killed, and sort of gives them a proper burial. Now, this little story, and it's not referred to later. What impression do we have of David?
He's kind of remorseful of what's happened.
He does something. Is this a positive impression? Do we get a positive impression of David?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we do.
Yes.
Because David does the things that he used to do all the time, right? He inquires, problem in the first thing is talking to God. And were the Gibeonites wronged?
Yes.
Yes. Did they have a right to ask for what they asked for?
I think so.
Yes, they did. So the Gibeonites are they're not the villains here. Saul did wrong. And the Gibeon, he needs to be accountable. And David, because choirs of the Lord, so he knows what's happening, David executes justice, right? I mean, we in the 21st century look at this and say, that's horrible. That's terrible that David would turn him over. First century, they had a right to ask for it. They had been wronged. They had been wronged in the sight of God. Saul had violated the covenant they had. And so they could have asked for a whole lot more than 7. But they didn't. And David executed justice, but David also did what at the end? So he's spiritual, he's a just king, but he's also compassionate at the end. He shows this compassion that again he doesn't have to show. Because we're talking about the descendants of Saul. He's got no reason. If this would appear to have, remember when we had the series, there were 3 stories that, each one showed that special quality of David as king, and this would be a 4th. Why would the writer not, and this would fit in with that really, really well. Why would he not put this in with those other 3? Because he sure could have. It would have made the narrative make more sense. This is just kind of thrown in there. You could read this and say, well, David's now had a change of heart. He's a new man. Well, I don't know that he's a new man. No other indication he's a new man. I think because 3 is a really important number. So the 3 stories, having 3 stories is really significant. That you've got 3, that's sort of the perfect number. This is the perfect proof that David is this good ruler as he's ascending to the peak. This is also a good story, but maybe not as good as the other 3. And so I still want you to hear it, but we're not going to put it there. We'll put it in the appendix. for you to look at later. But I think it reinforces the idea that David is the best of kings. Kind of makes the downfall even sadder. And then in verse 15, we're into another story, right? And what's going on in 15?
Battle of the Philistines.
We got battle. Now, have we been dealing with fighting Philistines lately?
All the time.
It's
In the past, but have we done it lately?
Lately?
No, we haven't. Philistines have been kind of quiet lately. David's been too busy fighting Absalom and Sheba. The Philistines have been kind of quiet. And how are the Philistines presented here? What's happening in this Philistine story?
They're trying to kill David.
Now the Philistines are trying to kill David. And evidently David is
Leading them.
leading,
Army.
leading the army. And when you say leading, he is literally leading because he is in front fighting off Philistines, right? In fact, he's fighting them off so much he's exhausted. And who steps forward?
However you say, Ben-Ob.
Yeah, well, we got a giant, right? And how is he described?
Handsome.
He is.
What did he say?
Yeah, I don't know that he's handsome,
Not everybody's handsome.
but he is quite a man, right? Because he is carrying
A spear.
a
Huge.
huge spear. All right. So David is weary. He's this giant, and we're going to see there are a lot of other giants wandering around. Who steps up and saves the king?
Abishai.
Okay. Abishai steps up and slays the giant, kills him. And then what's the result?
They tell David, don't do that again.
Don't lead us anymore. You're too important to lead us. Now, why? And so, boom, we got this little story. Well, why would this not be? David, we haven't had him fighting Philistines. In fact, we had the Philistines running, when he finally defeated them, they are out of the picture. They're gone, out of the land. And here we're fighting them again, so chronologically it doesn't make any sense that all of a sudden they're in the middle of this battle. Why wouldn't the writer, it's really interesting, why wouldn't the redactor move this story earlier in the narrative? Well, where it talked about David fighting the Philistines. Why would this be part of the appendix, along with this other story?
Maybe he didn't want it put in there yet.
Okay, now think about what the story does. What does this, the story does two things that's really interesting that might cause a little issue, at least in the way this narrative is being presented. Because all of this would be happening before David has reached his peak, right? Well, he's on the ascension. What does this story suggest about David?
He's on the weaker end.
That's right. That he isn't, well, again, he's been fighting all day, that he's tired. Maybe that's not what the writer how he wants to present David earlier in the story. That David is weary, becomes weary. So that would kind of reduce this perfect king image that the writer, because you present David as almost perfect, that means his fall is even more dramatic. If he is great, then the fall from greatness is even steeper.
And it's a lot to live up to for your whole lifetime.
Yeah, that's right. So this is what else does this story do? The men say, tell him what?
Not to go.
Don't go to battle anymore. Now, again, what does that do?
Symbolically, they said that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished.
That's right.
He's up front.
That's right. How does that change if we move this to where it probably, in the narrative, it probably belongs? How does that change this narrative that the writer has developed?
Well, when he was strong and winning all the battles and going with the men, he was up front and strong and leading them.
That's right.
And now he's on the weaker end and they don't want him up front.
That's right. Kind of, and it justifies, when we read what was in chapter 18, where when kings go out to war, David stayed home.
Right.
That kind of explains it, right? So that's right. Now that becomes less dramatic because we've already gotten that idea introduced into the story. Well, why did he stay home? Well, the men wanted to protect him. Well, see, that kind of that changes things. It's not then just his decision doing something different than what he was there to do. It makes it more complicated. Life is complicated, but stories generally aren't. Stories are generally pretty clean, so makes a lot of sense. What I find interesting here is why they put it in at all. Because if this story weren't there, I don't know what this contributes to the David narrative. Something, clearly, the writer thinks it does, because he's including it. I'm not sure. And then it gets even kind of crazier from my perspective. Then what does the writer start including in the rest of this little passage? Before we get to the end of 21.
Other battles.
Other battles, and focused on...
Who was killed?
Yeah, on these giants. These Philistine giants that are there. That have 6 fingers and toes, and how big their stuff, their weapons are. What role does this play in the narrative? I mean, even one of them called Goliath, that David doesn't kill. Somebody else kills him. What's the purpose? Now, I'm asking because I don't know what the purpose is. I don't know why the writer has chosen to spend so much time outlining Philistine giants that Israel beats. Yeah, it gives names and descriptions and, when you get into the toes on that, feet and fingers on their hands. And
the only thing I can glean from that, and it's going to be on the spiritual side, is that in life we face giants.
Yeah.
We face big battles, small battles, and even though the writer doesn't really say it, there's people there that protect David, so they still consider him a good king. If he wasn't, let him kill him. That type of thing. So for me, God is with David, protecting him through all these different means. It has more of a spiritual connotation to me, and it just tells me that in life we all face huge battles, and if it wasn't for God's protection around us. Anyway, that's where I go with that. Because I don't, like you said.
It doesn't seem to fit.
I just saw the spiritual side of it.
Yeah, so maybe, I don't know. So I'm telling you, I don't know. These just seem to be miscellaneous stories that the writers put at the end that you can interpret. There's a reason he's put it in there. What his reason is, I don't know, because I wasn't talking to him. You kind of glean reasons from what else he's written.
I have to tell you, I listened to your sermon on Mother's Day about the Holy Spirit of God. And so whatever you glean from the Word of God, the Spirit's talking to each and every one of us individually. That's how I perceived that spiritually.
What I'm doing is I'm trying to remember what I said on Mother's Day.
You're all careful what you say, because it was good.
Sometimes I don't, that's been a couple of weeks.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah, I know. I put it on YouTube.
That's right. That's why I heard it.
Yeah, that's... well, that's good.
It was good.
Well, what a wise person I was when I said those words that I can't quite remember.
It was impactful.
I'm glad. I'm really glad. It's always funny because on Saturday because I write my sermons on Saturday, and Saturday's a long day. But if I wrote them on, somebody said, why don't you write it on Friday? I'd love to write them on Friday. Somebody said, well, maybe it was somebody in here. Was it anybody in? I don't know. Whose father was a minister. Because it was somebody and said, oh, well, my dad always wrote it on Friday. And I said, I would love to be able to write my sermon on Friday. I'd love it. The trouble is, if I wrote it on Friday, I would rewrite it on Saturday. Because I would think of a better way to approach it. And so what I do is I'd write 2 sermons, one of them that I think is obviously better than the other. and that would be the one I give, and the other one I toss, because I'm not going to use one that's not as... And so that's why I write it on Saturday, because once it's done, it's done. We're not writing it again. Whatever it is, it is. And I'll get home on Saturday. And sometimes it's better now than it used to. Sometimes I get home at 12:30, in the morning. So it would be late. Now usually it's between 9:30. And Debbie will ask, well, how was your sermon? How's the sermon? And sometimes, I say, I think it flowed as I was writing it. I think the structure is good. I think it's structurally good, and I think it's on point. And other times I'll say, it's a mess. That serves a mess. And then if it's a mess, I'll say, we'll have to see tomorrow, because it's the next day I rehearse it. And sometimes when I rehearse it, then okay, it flows better than I thought. But when you finish it, you're looking and you're thinking, geez Louise, wow, and they pay me. But there's enough times I leave here saying the same thing.
You just have to remember, it's not about you.
Well,
it's
that's
all about
right.
God's
That's
story.
right. But we're craftsmen. I've got to take seriously what I do. If I didn't,
Well, you can't go to a cartoon.
Then so anyway, we got this miscellaneous story. Okay, we're done with that. But see, that's what I think he's doing at the end. We got these stories that don't really connect, and then in chapter 22, we're into something else. And what are we into chapter 22? Even if you look at your Bible, what do we got?
David's Psalms of praise.
Yeah.
We got a psalm, right? That's what we've got. In fact, we've got a psalm that's in the Psalter. Because that's Psalm 18. That's moved here. So it's all, like I said, I think it's fairly accurate that the writer has this stuff left over. And what I like it, but I can't fit it into the narrative anywhere else because it's going to change the flow of the narrative. So I'm going to put it at the end. And now I've got a psalm that I am putting at the end. Now, I told you one of the things that we see, and we've been shaped by rationalism. We're rational people. For the last 250 years, we're rational. And therefore, if an author is given, then the author had to have written it. Because that's what we believe. We believe that for 300 years. That if it says by so-and-so, and if somebody else wrote it and somebody else claims it, if a person wrote it and somebody else claims it, that is called plagiarism. And we make a big deal about it because that's wrong. Well, understand, that's only about 300 years old. We've only thought that way for 300 years, which is fine. It's not bad. In 300 years, we may not think that way anymore, but that's the way we think now. That's not the way ancient people thought. Heck, that's not the way John Adams thought before the American Revolution, because he wrote in somebody else's name. So it's not something that was important in the past, certainly not as important now. My point is, when you look at the Psalms, David was associated with playing the harp, was a musician. And so anything or a lot of music in the Old Testament is immediately associated with the only musician that you have. It must have been written by David. Now, I think that's relatively important to sort of file away, because I've heard a lot of folks, ministers and interpreters, that are shaped by rational thought, and this is fine, I guess, say, well, when was this written in David's life? When did this happen in David's life? Well, I think you're making a mistake, because David may not have written it. It was attributed to him, but it may not have been written by him. And to somehow tie it to some part in his life, when it's not part of the psalm itself, you may be taking a step that's leading you to a misinterpretation. Instead of letting the psalm stand on its own, you're forcing it into a place where it may not belong.
Right.
Just one of the things, just like Solomon, same thing's going to happen with wisdom. Anything that's any wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, is going to be attributed to Solomon because he was wise. Didn't mean he couldn't have written Ecclesiastes. The language is all wrong. People didn't speak the language that Ecclesiastes is written when Solomon was king. So he was writing in a foreign language that didn't exist yet. So he couldn't have written it. But, Solomon must have written it because it says it's by Solomon. Go for it. That's fine, as long as it doesn't lead you astray. Anyway, we've got a psalm, and what is happening in this psalm, and we could go through it in detail, but I'm not sure we necessarily need to do it in detail. What is in essence? What's this psalm about? And it covers the whole chapter, right? Okay, it's about praising. The focus is on praising God, and so as he approaches God in praise, he does what we see in the Psalms, in the Psalter. You can break it into different parts. For instance, if you look at verses 1 through 20, if you just scan those, what's going on in 1 through 20?
It's praising God for protecting.
Okay, for protecting. So it's praising for God's protection, and what in that does it would cause you to come to that conclusion? What in what he has written would point you in that direction? What are some of the things he says that would say, yeah, this is, David saying, thank you, Lord, for protecting me?
Smoke rose from his nostrils, consuming the fire.
Okay, the smoke coming from his nostrils. Whose nostrils? God's nostrils. Smoke, which indicates what?
I think it would indicate anger.
Yeah, anger. And why is that good? Why is David saying, yeah, that's a good thing? Because what is God doing?
Listening.
Yeah, he's doing what for David?
He's saving them.
He's saving him, So if I want to be saved, I want the guy who's saving me to be snorting fire. I want him to be fighting on my side, right? All right, so we got the first part of this, thanking God for delivering. And delivering, and God has the power to deliver. Therefore, thanking him is well placed. God isn't just hanging around in the background. As things work out, God is what?
In charge.
God is in charge, right? God is actively engaged in doing this. He's thundering from the heavens. He's sending out bolts of lightning. And notice how often he uses the images of water, drawing me out of mighty waters. And that's calling up an image, symbolism that is really important to ancient people, particularly for the Jews. And we talked about it months, maybe over a year ago. Water is this symbol of, you remember what water? Chaos. Water is a symbol of chaos in the ancient world, particularly for the Jews, but other people as well, because water, particularly the sea, is something you can't control. You stand on shore and you look at the ocean. You can change the land. I mean, you can change things on the land. You can water, you can plant, you can plow, you can do things. You can move herds of sheep around. You can do things on dry land. But the ocean, you control the waves? Heck no. You control the storms? Heck no. You send boats out? Sometimes they come back. Usually they come back. Sometimes they don't. You don't have any control over that. And so water becomes this very natural symbol of chaos. And we see that even in Genesis 1, that's the first creation story. That God doesn't create out of nothing in Genesis 1. God doesn't create out of nothing. Because it says the presence of God, what? Hovered over the face of the deep. So what was at the beginning of creation? Water. And so the story of creation is God not physically creating a universe, but God doing what? Bringing order out of chaos. Bringing order out of chaos. Creating a bubble in the midst of the chaos, because water surrounds this thing that God has created. This bubble. And that's why the story of the flood is so pertinent. What does God do in the story of the flood?
He sends them out in the ark for 40 days.
He removes the protection. And that's what it says. The windows of the sky open. The springs of the deep open. God just removes his protection. So chaos reasserts itself on creation. When God is lifting David out of the water, that's very pertinent symbolic language. He's saving David from this chaos. So we've got him thanking God for what he's done. We've seen like a shift when we get to verse 1, like 21 through 28. And what seems to be going on in 21 through 28 that's a little different?
He's got confessing before God his sins.
Okay, he's confessing before God his sins. And what does God do?
Show his forgiveness.
He shows forgiveness. So God is, in the first, God is delivering me, right? And in this little second part, when he's confessing and demonstrating his righteousness, God is aware of that, right? God is aware of that and forgives because of that. And then we have another tonal shift in verse 29. And what does he start talking about in 29 to the end?
That he starts putting light back in his life.
Yes, okay. God is putting light, which is really interesting. God is doing what? Now look at the flow. The beginning, God is rescuing, right? God has rescued me from chaos. And now when I turn to God, God is aware of and rewarding of my righteousness. And now at the end, God is doing what? When you said about light.
Darkness into light, and with his help he can advance against the truth.
Okay, so what is God doing for David?
He's blessing him.
Yes, he's now blessing. Not for just forgiving him, but now he's blessing. And the power that God has can be seen through David.
Yes.
That God is infusing David with some of his authority and power. So we've got this nice little flow in this psalm. When you look at the Psalms, you have different kinds of Psalms. And this is a praise. This is a psalm of praise. And therefore David can praise God for what God is doing. Now, when would this psalm, if we did put it, since he's putting it in this at the end of this narrative on the life of David, so we might assume that it's there, and he just chose not to maybe slow down his story. Because remember, this story really was moving. The writer really was pushing this story. Earlier, maybe he didn't want to shove in a psalm, because that would kind of slow down the momentum of his story.
It's a summary, isn't it?
What's that?
Doesn't it seem like
Yeah, it becomes almost a summary of what David is. But it certainly wouldn't be something David would say at the end. Because I don't know that David, after the second revolt he's had to put down, is saying, thank you, God, for infusing me with great power. Maybe the first part, thank you for saving me, but there doesn't seem to be that optimism at the end of the narrative. So where this fits, I don't know. But it doesn't seem to fit well here at the end. Okay, so we've got that. What's going on in 20? So we got this psalm. What's going on in 23? The writer then tells us what's happening in 23.
The last one.
Okay, now we're coming in for a landing, right? Mm-hmm. And how is David described? Now, I want you to notice where we talked about this a lot when we were in Genesis, but we haven't talked a huge amount about it lately. Remember, one of the things we saw in Genesis is when you look at the stories in Genesis, the different stories, there were stories that, and they seem pretty consistent. There are stories where God is named, or the deity is named God, Elohim. That's the name for God, and that's the name given in that story. Consistent. You have other stories where El or Elohim doesn't appear, and what becomes the name for God? Lord. Okay, you have these strands, and the Lord stories seem to be over here, and there's something, they all have some things in common, and then the God stories are sort of over here, and they have things in common, and the redactor has sort of put them all together. Well, we haven't seen that very often, but I think we see a glimpse of it here. Because the name for God throughout 2 Samuel has consistently been, what has God been called?
Lord.
Lord. Consistently Lord. And remember, those are the 4 letters that no Jew will say out loud. That's why they say Adonai, which is, Lord. That's why they won't say those 4 letters. Well, why wouldn't you say those four letters? Why wouldn't you say the 4 letters? This is the name of God. Why wouldn't you say that out loud? Why would the Jews not do that?
They don't think it's right.
Well, good. Why don't they think that's right?
You don't have the right to do it?
Yes, that is exactly right. You don't have the right to say the name of God. Because if I say the name of God, what am I suggesting?
That you're above.
What's that?
You're placing yourself on it.
Yes, both of you. That's right. That I have power over God.
Yeah.
I'm acting in His name. And when you think about, legally, if I'm acting in somebody else's name, then I can do what?
Whatever you want.
I can do whatever I think they want me to do. What I think they want me to do. And so the Jews are very careful. You do not say the name of God, because that's suggesting you have power over God. Jesus will say the same thing about demons. When do demons lose their power? He says it. What do you do to take the power away from demons? You name them. You name them. When demons have names, when you name them, that's why they'll ask, what's your name? When you name it, they lose the power. They lose power. You don't do that with God. So you don't say the name of God out loud. Those 4 letters, it's the proper name of God. Instead, they would use the word Adonai when they would read this text. They didn't even put vowel points. The Hebrew language, the written language, was initially not to be read out loud. It was just to be read, but not articulated. To articulate, you need consonants and vowels. The name of God, they don't put vowel points. If you look at a page of Hebrew, you'll see all these letters, and then underneath them, dashes and dots. You won't, except when you get to the name of God. And there won't be any dashes and dots under it, because no Jew is supposed to say those 4 letters. Instead, when you're reading the text out loud and you hit those 4 letters, you say Adonai, which is a completely different word that translated into Greek is Kyrios, which is translated into English, Lord. That's why whenever you see in your Bible the Lord in all caps, usually it's small caps, big first letter and small O-R-D. When you see that in your Bible, that's the proper name of God. That's the word there. That's the word used. Well, that becomes really important, because Adonai, the word Adonai, is also used as a word, but it doesn't mean the same
You
thing.
gotta throw in Yahweh.
Well, one of the things with, and I'm always personally, and this is me, I'm personally uncomfortable with that, because what I'm doing is what the Jews say you should never do.
Right.
You should never use that word, because you're suggesting, and you got a lot of some English
You're
translations.
suggesting what with Yahweh? I know they're not to say it, in fact, it's more like a... What I would say is you say Lord, and that's what most translations have, but you have some, the Jerusalem Bible translation translates it, and I think that's unfortunate. I mean, you can do it, but to me it takes away that Jewish intention.
that this is the word you do not say. And sort of for me, respect for what they believe, I'm not going to do it. What's interesting, and we're going to finish this up, the word Jehovah, it's a fascinating word, because that's not Jewish at all. Jehovah's not in the Bible at all. Jehovah's not even a word. It's an English word, but it's not a Jewish word. You won't find Jehovah anywhere in Judaism. What they did with the name for God has no vowels. So you really can't pronounce it. That's why they don't put vowels in it. You can kind of do it if you work at it, but that's why they don't put vowel points on it. If you take the vowels from the word Adonai and take those vowels and put it into those 4 letters that spell the proper name of God, now you have Jehovah. So Jehovah is sort of a created word, taking consonants from one word and adding vowels from another. And you get a new word, Jehovah, which doesn't exist. If you say that to a Jew would, it doesn't exist. It's
Church of
not a
God
word.
has all the names. They have them up at
Yeah.
all the names. Yeah, Yahweh. So-
Yeah.
And isn't there? I know there is somewhere in here where I don't know if it was Jesus was taking out one of the evil spirits, and he told him to say his name.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what it reminded me of here. Was that? I knew
Yeah.
I knew it.
I think the part I love of the Bible when, and you're talking about the name of God, when Moses said to him, "Who shall I say sent me?" And he said, "I am."
I am. Yep. Great. I
What
am.
more can you say? I am.
Right. And that's the name.
Yeah.
That's the name we don't say. And that's a whole thing with how John uses.
We've gone into another study.
Yeah, that's a whole.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got David, and because we're talking about paws and tails right here, and I don't want to belabor this, and sure don't want to pick up on it next week. How does this end? Let's tie this up, because we got a lot of stuff. We got a narrative about different warriors. 3 warriors. We've got this business about 30 chiefs that come and 3 warriors. And again, it's back when David was fighting. The Philistines were fighting
Yeah.
David, and he got water and poured the water out. What do we get from these last stories? What are the topics that the writer includes? Because there's really no tie between them. It's like there's no narrative anymore.
We just talk about the different people that fought against each other.
Yeah,
Over again, like the Philistines.
we got identifying David's warriors, and the business. David's in a cave. But when was David in a cave? Yeah, when he was running for Saul. This was a long time ago. This was in First Samuel. He was in a cave, and the Philistines were there. And what was it about the 3 chiefs of the 30 get him? He says to him what? What does he tell him he needs? He's thirsty. Bring me water, but I want water from Bethlehem. And what do? But Bethlehem is in the hands of the Philistines.
They go get it for him.
They go get it for him, and when they bring it to him,
He offers it to God.
yeah, he pours it out, which must have made those 3 guys really happy that they'd risk their life to get it for David, and then he pours it out because he shouldn't be getting water, for risking their life to get water for him, and it's an interesting little story that may have a meaning. Dedication to God, but certainly doesn't fit at the end of the David story. And then the last story, and about the 30, he lists the 30 people and why some of them are one of the 3. And what about 24? What's going on in chapter 24?
He counts how many fighting men he has, trying to kind of sum them up.
What does he do? What is he doing in chapter 24?
You told him to take a census.
He takes a
Israel and
census.
Judah.
You know, he's taking a census. And it's led, the motivation for the census is,
Pride.
well, the anger of the Lord is kindled
Oh.
against Israel. God, because it's all in this, it's in a God context, because this is evidently a story that isn't one of the later ones, because David seems to have pretty strong control here. You know, he's not fighting rebellions. So the God is angry at the Israelites, but do we know why? No. But because the Lord is angry with them, David does what? Go and take a census, right?
Yeah.
And Joab says to him, you know, you got a lot of people, but why do we need to?
Get more.
Yeah, why do we need to count them?
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, why do we need to count them? But David says,
So I know how many there are.
yeah, you got to do it anyway. And so what does Joab do?
He says, may the Lord your God multiply the troops.
Yeah,
Hundreds.
yeah. And so he goes and counts, right? And then how does David react once he gets to report and finds out how many? What does David then end up doing? He asks for forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, there's a certain amount of irony here, because why would this be really an astute thing for a king to do a census? What does it give? What does it give a king? I mean, there's a reason why we have censuses in the United
He
States.
feels like he's got more power.
You get more power. What do you do with a census?
Nothing.
Oh, that's it. That's right. You know where people are, so you tax them.
Yeah, I forgot.
What else can you do to them?
They got control.
You could call them up to be in your military. You can call them up to build something. You know where they are if you want a construction. This is exactly what Samuel said earlier. This is what kings are going to do. You know, they're going to take your people. They're going to work you, because that's what kings do. You're going to fight their wars, whether you want to fight them or not, because then you're going to pay taxes. And that's what censuses do. I mean, it tells you exactly where people are. And that's what David has done. He feels remorse, which doesn't seem to be a characteristic at the end of his life. And he ends up doing what at the very end of the story?
Building an altar.
Builds an altar, buys, you know, the floor of a threshing floor for an altar. He also, God said, because of this, and this is the story you talked about, that because he's done this, and again, we're sort of blending the king and country. You know, what the king does, country pays the consequences for it. The king is good, the country is good. If the king is bad, the country suffers.
What's going on
You
today?
know, country suffers. Yeah, you know. So so David confesses. What does the prophet tell David? Since you have done this wrong, God's given you can select the prize behind one of three curtains. What's behind curtain number 1? 3 years of famine. What's behind curtain number 2? 3 months of running away from your enemy. What's behind curtain number 3? Okay, you're going to have 3 days of pestilence. So you get to choose. It's really interesting. David doesn't make a choice, but he chooses the curtain he doesn't want. What curtain does he not choose?
The hands of man.
He doesn't choose the one running away from my enemies. That's not the choice. You know, my enemies are not going to be given power. I don't want the human enemies to be given power. Therefore, I don't want to be running away from my foes. So I'll take either curtain number 1 or curtain number 3. And what curtain does God choose?
3.
Curtain number 3. And so the pestilences of the land, what does David end up doing in the face of his pestilence? Now he makes the offering. He gets the threshing floor and offers an oxen, and, things are nice. The pestilence, the plague is gone, from Israel. It's kind of like this is the last of the stories, and the writer is done. So what do we take from, not these stories, because these stories, like I told, my father used to say, my dad had the ability to recognize, we all have gifts. God has given us all gifts. My dad has a lot of gifts. One in particular. My father can, and this is amazing, he can identify a toupee. He has the ability to recognize a toupee. Even a really good one. He can always recognize it. From the time I was a kid, he could spot him in the crowd. That guy's wearing a toupee. And so you kind of get close to him, and there's a slight difference. And, all the hair is ending at the same place around. It looks like a toupee to me. And when a toupee, but Dad would recognize that certain toupees were good and certain toupees weren't. Ted Danzig has a wonderful toupee, Dad would say. Great toupee. So good that you didn't even notice it. Yes, he has a great toupee. But others weren't so great. And Dad's description of that toupee would be, he'd say, that toupee looks like paws and tails. Paws and tails. Paws and tails. That's what it was. Like bits and pieces of animals were just glued to his head. And not even the good parts, the paws and tails. And that was his. This is kind of what we're looking at with these stories. These hit me as kind of paws and tails. Each of them, they have meaning, but I think they're sort of an accumulation. What do we take from these stories? What is the legacy David leaves? If we say Samuel, the books of Samuel is really primarily about God. David is the human protagonist through most of it. What becomes his legacy as we leave the books of Samuel?
Well, his love of the Lord.
Okay.
And his mostly always going to God for guidance.
When David was good,
Yes.
He would go to the Lord.
Yes.
That was part of his legacy. What else is part of David's legacy that we are going to carry with us? So we have this example. What else do we have as we leave these books?
Thing like, for instance, David killing a giant.
Okay, David's, bravery.
Yes.
Although when we looked at the giant, he used his skills, his shepherding skills. I mean, he would fight bears off with, a sling. So he knew how to use a sling. So David not only was brave, but also smart enough to use what he had to his advantage. Okay, what else? So we take that. What else do we take? What else is David's legacy? God made a promise to David, didn't he? What was God's promise that he made to David? Remember, when David gets into Jerusalem, moves the ark into the city, he gets cedar from Lebanon and builds a palace. What does David decide he's going to do? He's going to build a temple, a house for God. And Nathan, his advisor, says yes until God speaks to Nathan, and Nathan says to him, no. What is God's promise to David?
Build him a house.
I'm going to build you a house. You're not going to build me a house, I'm going to build you a house. And what is the house that God is going to build for David?
His lineage.
It's going to be his lineage. And that Davidic king is going to be, remember I told you, becomes one of the things Jews will look to be reminded that God is with them. They're looking for signs. One of the signs is they've been given land. All the way back to Abraham, we have the land. As long as we have the land, we know God is with us. We have the law through Moses. As long as we have the law, we know God is with us, and we have a Davidic king. And as long as we have a Davidic king, we know that God is with us. So this is something that's kind of being established. We see that in the New Testament, carried over in the New Testament too. On the negative side, what are some of there are a lot of positive legacies he leaves. What are some of the more negative ones that may play a part in the future stories?
How he was weak.
Okay.
With Bathsheba.
Yeah, there's a weakness, and the weakness was a result of what? Of not following God. It's consequences of choices that he's made. So legacy, a negative legacy, maybe it's negative, maybe it's not. That behavior has consequences. God didn't bail David out. He had to pay the consequences of his actions. And that's certainly a legacy that he's leaving. What else? Near the end of the story, what happens near the end of the David stories? And I'm not talking about these Paws and Tails. I'm talking about the end of the stories we looked at last week. What's the situation?
He does listen to his men when they tell him not to go out.
Okay,
Even before this story.
That's right.
This other, they told him not to.
And he's standing at the gate. Yeah, he's just standing there sitting and waiting for the news.
Yeah.
Remember the story of Sheba? Remember the story of Sheba? What happened with him that may be pertinent as we move into the books of the Kings?
He took the rest of the other 10 tribes.
Okay, remember it was at a break between Judah and the other 10 tribes. Because the 10 tribes were jealous of Judah, Absalom's tribe, David's tribe. And Sheba was able to do what to those 10 tribes? Bring them together.
Take them away.
And that break that we see when David is king, that break between the 10 tribes, 10 northern tribes, and Judah, and what will be Benjamin, but Simeon is in there too. The tribes of the south. That's going to be something important that we want to file away, because the break has already occurred. There's a fracture there that may widen as we look at the books of the Kings. You know, what's going to happen in this confederation of tribes. So David becomes really a more complex figure when we look at the books of Samuel than if we just read the Bible stories on David. Because in the Bible story, David's a pretty good guy. Made a mistake, but still was a pretty good guy. Redactor of Samuel, books of Samuel, I'm not sure. He's more complicated than that.
But it just seems like a sort of maybe like an oxymoron or something. He'll go and pray to God and ask him what to do, and God will tell him, and he'll go do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that part, him and them go rob and steal from other people and bring it back. So it's, it's like two sides of the coin. It's just...
Right. Well, and one of the things, and just as to file away as we deal with that, because I think the writer is fairly careful to make David really good and then sly. And that's why he doesn't muddy it up with some of these other stories. From an ancient perspective, even when he was raiding, when he was in Ziklag and was raiding, where did he not raid? Even though the king of Gath, the Philistines, thought he was, because he'd tell them,
The Israelites.
he wasn't raiding Israelites. He was raiding other people. And so I think, again, that may be a 21st century perspective. I'm not sure that was, when the writer included that story, I don't know that he saw that as a negative, that David was raiding. Because that's kind of what people did. That's what kings did. So it certainly is something that we have to grapple with as modern readers. But that's what we have to do with the Bible anyway. Because as modern readers, there are things in the Bible that don't make sense. I mean, why can't we eat shellfish? I mean, that seems pretty arbitrary. Why did God say we can't have lobster? Well, that's pretty stupid. That doesn't make any sense. Well, it does 4,000 years ago make sense. when you don't have refrigeration, that's pretty dangerous to be eating shellfish. But we have refrigeration now, which means maybe God wouldn't make it a commandment now. So you almost have to get into kind of a
Evolution.
an ancient perspective and read it that way. It gets a little dangerous when we take a 21st century perspective and assume that they were thinking like we think, because they just weren't. They couldn't. How could they? They haven't accumulated enough knowledge. And in 2,000 years, people will have a whole lot more knowledge than we have now. And they'll look at us and say, how could they have been so incredibly stupid? Do you realize, what they were doing to cure diseases? You never believe what they were doing. They take a knife and cut through skin and flesh and bone and muscle to treat somebody. Talk about barbaric. How can you believe that people were actually doing that kind of stuff? But they did it. 1,000 years ago, that's the way they did it.
That's it.
Things change. And that's what also makes Scripture both challenging and exciting, because it's getting in that mindset and then bringing the Word.
The cloven feet, not to eat anything of the cloven foot.
Mm-hmm.
So pork was definitely
Right.
one of those, and to me that would be, it's more symbolic than whether you eat the flesh of that or whatever. It's a dirty animal. So there you go.
Yes.
God says stay away from the dirt. Stay in the light.
What did your grandmother, I'll guarantee your grandmother said it about pork. What did she used to say about pork?
I don't know, in French we ate everything pork.
Well, but yeah, you did. So did we. But what did they say about it? You better cook it.
Yeah.
You better cook it well.
Yes.
It better not be pink, because if it's at all pink, you'll get worms. You'll get worms. Because pork, you'll get worms. Well, I mean, that's what good night. That's what I grew up with my grandmother saying. My mother said it.
Yes.
My wife still says it. When I watch these cooking shows and they're saying, oh yeah, pork can be
Pink.
Pork can be pink.
So New
that pork can be pink because you don't have worms in it anymore. Oh, it can be pink. Chicken shouldn't, but pork can be. And my wife, if you ask my wife, if I put a pork loin in front of her that's a little bit juicy, she won't eat it. It's got to be dried out. You got to flake it.
Like my mother-in-law's roast. By the time it got done, it was a hockey puck.
My grandmother, you took a chisel and chiseled off chips. It's like, what it's like if you've ever seen that Christmas Vacation movie and they eat the turkey.
Yeah.
That was my grandmother's roast. You cut it and they go. Only a roast was, it was like charcoal.
What about Buddha?
What about Buddha?
Buddha, that's a French word for blood sausage.
Oh, blood sausage. Andouille. We used to in South Louisiana. Andouille. Oh yeah, we have andouille sausage.
And I looked at your face. When I was
It's
a
a blood
child, I
sausage.
couldn't wait to eat
It's
it.
a blood
I mean, there's
sausage.
actually blood in it.
Well, they that's part of what they put in the grinder.
Oh, because I know we lived on a farm up in Indiana, and a farm on the other side of like the main roadside. Okay, they would hang up
What's your
their
story?
animals and drain the blood, and then they would make blood pudding. I just the thought of that made me gag.
Hey, in the Sahara, just sub-Sahara, that's what the Maasai tribes in sub-Saharan Africa, or Sahara Africa. I mean, they have cattle, and they don't eat their cattle. They milk and they bleed the cattle because blood is protein. And you can't afford to slaughter. You slaughter a cow, you're taking away a lot of potential protein to have, a roast. So that what they do is they bleed it. They bleed their cattle and mix it with the milk, and that gives them protein to survive because that's what they do.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So let's have lunch.
I have a recipe hint about pork, and I just came across this. I can't believe 75 years and I just figured this out. But it was through Google. So pork chops and pork tends to be dry because you cook it.
Yeah.
So I just read this through Google, and the Chinese do this, and you take baking soda. So like I got pork chops, and I tried it the other day, first time, very pleased.
Oh,
So you got pork chops, and I just wet them, and then I take a little handful of baking soda, and you just do this on each side of the pork chop. Not a whole lot, because you put it in the refrigerator for 15 minutes. You take the pork chop out, you rinse it off, or whatever it is, and you cook that thing the way you would normally cook, however you cook. Moist,
Really?
tender,
Wow.
moist. I was like, oh my gosh, I just learned this trick. So, for all of you ladies that want to cook them for your wife,
and, well,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah,
advise or leave a
I
message.
cook a lot.
Oh,
there
I
you go. Get the
do
hint, yes.
most of
There you
it.
go.
Yeah.
A little bit of that.
I love
I was
pork chops.
amazed
I do,
how
yeah.
moist, because I don't like pork
Dry.
chops, they're too dry.
I don't either.
And it was moist and tender, and they advised not to leave it in there longer than 15 minutes, because then your meat's gonna turn to mush. Kind of makes sense to me for, there's a salt contents in the baking soda, which draws in the juices of the pork. You rinse it off, so you don't have, but the juices have already been pulled into the pork. And then when you cook it, it's gonna stay moist. It just makes sense to me. I don't know why I didn't.
Have
Anyway,
to,
try it, I'm hoping.
now baking soda, because I heard,
Baking soda.
not powder, soda.
No, there's no salt and powder.
Okay, all right.
You just, it needs
So we're
salt.
using baking soda?
Baking soda,
Okay.
but it's this.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know, you don't have to cover the whole thing, just
Yeah.
one of these numbers. On both sides,
Yeah,
15
well, that's
minutes.
good.
I'm gonna try that.
Well, let's have a word of prayer and then we,
Go
yeah,
eat something.
yeah. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time as we explored the story of David. Help us to claim those positive aspects of his character and integrate them into ourselves, but also help us to recognize his weaknesses. And if those are also our weaknesses, and often they are, help us to be aware of it and help us to do what would be appropriate in reducing their influence on our lives. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen.
Now what are we supposed